What's one family saying or phrase you heard growing up that still sticks with you?
They said it like a favor wrapped in a slap, a little sugar around the knife, told to Mark with the practiced smile of people who believe logistics can pass for love, and I felt my stomach harden as the coordinator leaned in, adjusted a boutonniere that did not belong to him, and whispered, almost kindly, that he would not be walking Emily because, quote, he was just the money, not the father. And I had to breathe through my nose the way you do when a hot pan pops grease on your wrist and you pretend you are fine so no one rushes over to help. I stood at the back with him, my big brother who once taught me to parallel park with a folded towel as a fake curb, who showed up at every county meet, every recital, every dentist appointment that made her cry, and I watched his jaw move like he was chewing gravel, watched him swallow that sentence until it settled in his chest where the old loyalty used to be. The lights in the hall were doing that warm golden wash that makes everyone look softer than they are, and the string quartet was fighting the air conditioning with a romantic waltz that somehow made the chairs look expensive, and the stepfather, Greg with the blazer that fit like a boast, and the stance of a man who enjoys doors opening for him, took Emily's arm with a flourish that had practiced in the mirror written all over it, while Mark pressed 2 fingers to the program as if it were a passport and he had just been denied entry, and I thought, no, not like this, not after the late checks and the early mornings and the quiet rides home where he let her be furious without asking her to apologize. I am not Noble. I am Caroline, the sister who brings an emergency kit to events because I do not trust fate to meet a schedule. And while the officiant cleared his throat in that theatrical way officiants do when they want the room to hush itself, I looked at the layout, the speaker cables, the DJ tucked behind a hedge of rented ferns, the slideshow laptop waiting to autoplay the highlights reel that always leans heavy on toddlers and bathtubs, and I felt a little lightning rod of pettiness stand up inside me, not mean for the sake of mean, but sharp the way a needle is sharp when you have a splinter and no one else knows how to get it out. Mark kept saying he was fine. Men say that the way a house says it is fine while the basement fills with water, and he touched the back of his tie like he was checking whether dignity had a zipper, and I told him I needed to fix a pin and slipped away. Which was not entirely a lie because what I needed to fix was the pin in this narrative that tried to turn a father into a debit card and a stranger into a hero. I slid behind the ferns, tapped the DJ on the elbow, and handed him a folded bill and a folded truth, and he looked at me like I had just asked him to break federal law, then softened when I gave him the line he could hide behind, the one about honoring the people who raised the bride, plural on purpose, casual like air. And he nodded because weddings are full of small braveries that happen in the shadows, usually by women in uncomfortable shoes. Out there, the aisle had begun its slow theater, Emily luminous and trembling, Greg absorbing credit like solar panels, the room performing joy while scanning for mistakes. And I reached the slideshow laptop with hands that did not shake because I have done much worse with much less time, pulled a flash drive from my clutch, and moved 4 photos, not all, not a takedown, just enough to tilt the light toward truth. The one of Mark teaching her to ride without training wheels in a parking lot, with chalk lines and skin knees. The one of him asleep in a hospital chair with a juice box straw still bent because she needed surgery, and he refused to leave. The one of the two of them at a thrift store prom dress fitting where laughter saved the day, and the tailor knocked $10 off out of respect. The one where she is moving into her dorm, smiling because the futon is crooked and he is pretending to be a contractor. I placed them early and late so the crowd would see a breadcrumb trail no speech could erase. By the time they reached the front, the quartet had polished off its romance and swapped to something that sounded like relief, and the officiant launched into the prologue that couples pick when they want poetry without the risk of actual vulnerability. And I slid back beside Mark, who still looked like a man watching his house through a window while someone else sits on his couch, and I told him, quietly, that sometimes the right thing is not to make a scene but to let the scene make itself, and that he should keep breathing because the air would eventually remember him. When the first round of toasts began and Greg cleared his throat with the gusto of a man about to narrate his own myth, the screens blinked. The DJ said in that firm, friendly voice that is really a shield, that the bride had asked for a quick moment honoring everyone who raised her, plural again, small word, big knife, and the photos stepped forward like reliable witnesses, tender without being sentimental, undeniable without being cruel. And the room shifted by a few degrees the way a boat does. When someone important steps aboard, I did not look at Linda because I am not brave enough to catch a hurricane with my eyes. But I heard the clink of a glass put down harder than necessary and the soft intake of breath that means the story is adjusting its spine. Mark did not cry because he does not perform pain for strangers, yet his shoulders loosened like the suit had learned a better language, and when Emily turned, just a fraction, a reflex, little girl instinct peeking out from the tall white costume. She saw the image of her feet on the blacktop and her father's hands hovering, not touching, just ready, and something flickered at the corners of her mouth that no makeup artist can paint, a thank you that had not found its words, and in that small movement I felt the petty lightning drain from my body and be replaced by something steadier, something like a promise to myself that I would keep doing the quiet work nobody applauds if that is what it took to keep history honest. I will not dress it up and call it noble revenge because I know what I did. I set the table so truth could eat before vanity got seconds, and it tasted better than a dramatic speech or a smashed centerpiece because it landed exactly where it needed to. Not on Greg's lapel or Linda's pride, but on Emily's memory, which is the only place that matters when the flowers have wilted and the rented forks have gone back to their plastic crates, and as the applause rolled on like an expensive breeze. Mark lifted his glass in a small salute to no one in particular, a private toast to endurance, and I leaned in and told him that silence can be a blade if you sharpen it right, and that tomorrow might be loud in all the wrong ways. If you ask the polite version of how we got here, people will tell you divorce papers and school schedules, a second household, and a new last name on a mailbox, but the truth, at least the one I keep folded like a receipt I know I will need later, is that the split did not begin when Linda signed anything. It began the first time someone praised Greg for doing something Mark had been doing for years without applause. The grocery runs that became meal trains, the study nights that turned into report cards, the cold early mornings when the only thing that got Emily to lace her shoes for practice was the promise of a drive-through hot chocolate and the way her father's silence made room for her to be dramatic without judgment. And no matter how many lawyers or mediators walk through a family, resentment grows fastest in the shade of misattribution, especially when money is visible and care is not, because checks come with lines for signatures and love does not. When Linda married Greg, the transition came with a lot of PowerPoint energy, a bullet point rollout of new traditions, and a revised brand language for the word family, which suddenly had a committee. And while Mark kept paying what the court required and then some, because he believed that stability for Emily meant she never felt the budget shake under her feet, Greg began collecting little trophies of perception, teacher's notes that said, "Thank you for being involved," Instagram captions that implied, without ever daring to say outright, that the hero in the room was the one who printed schedules in color, and I watched how the story edged Mark to the margins, not on the days that were hard. Because on those days instinct betrayed pretense and Emily called her father from the floor of her closet, but on the days that looked like a commercial, the family barbecues where the camera finds the person with tongs and crowns him monarch. I learned to keep receipts, literally and otherwise, not out of spite but out of self-defense, because narrative creep is a quiet thief. And when Emily started college and the orientation weekend turned into a pageant of who gets photographed carrying the mini fridge up the stairs, I made sure the bursar emails landed in her personal inbox and not in Linda's group thread. And I nudged the settings on her student portal so that the account name displayed the donor of the tuition payments with the unsubtle clarity of a billboard, Mark A. Wade, father, because if you are going to build a memory palace, you ought to label the rooms correctly, and no, I did not ask permission, because permission is a door that always seems to jam when women push it. On Thanksgiving of her sophomore year, we gathered at Linda's new place, a house with all the warmth and none of the memory, a place built to impress the eucalyptus of a staging brochure, and I watched Greg angle himself to give the toast, chin lifted, voice ready. The cadence of a man who thinks microphones are foreplay, and I felt the old irritation square its shoulders. I switched the place cards while Linda reheated gravy, slipped Emily between Mark and the seat I was supposed to take, and forced proximity to do what logic had been denied, because sometimes it matters who is within whispering distance when the past taps a glass spoon against its patience, and when Greg began his speech about blended blessings and modern tribes. Emily's knee turned toward the man who had waited in orthodontist lobbies and folded laundry that did not fit inside any Instagram square, and although she did not interrupt the toast, her hand found Mark's wrist under the table, a small, stubborn truth. That? I watched like a candle in wind. I am not saying I did not enjoy the next part, because honesty without confession is just diplomacy with lipstick. I had already mailed the scholarship office a neat little packet of documentation, canceled checks, payment confirmations. That bursar ledger with the kind of clean typography that makes people resist the urge to argue, and when winter awards rolled around and the dean read the list of parents whose contributions kept students afloat, the auditorium sound system did what it always does. It made certain names bigger than others, and I sat back while Linda tried to rearrange her smile and Greg applauded with a little too much vigor to sell nonchalance. And the recognition was not a cashback coupon or a victory lap, it was a correction. The kind that does not bruise but does leave a mark, quiet, durable, impossible to crop out. Of course, every ledger has a counter-entry, and spring brought the subtle escalation that always follows exposure. Greg began introducing himself not only as stepdad, but, when he thought no one who knew us was listening, as the man who had raised her. The words tossed with that casual arrogance people use when they test a boundary and find no electric fence, and the next time I saw the wedding planning spreadsheet, yes, Google makes it easy for people to weaponize logistics. I noticed the processional tab where names had been shifted like furniture. Mark slid to row 5 as though love obeyed alphabetical order, and a well-meaning planner commenting that the bride would prefer to reduce tension optics by having one father at the aisle and one father at the back like a spare tire. I wish I could say I called Linda and said something cinematic that measured out truth in tablespoons and made her swallow it without choking, but marriages and grudges have their own physics, and I don't break laws of nature without a harness. Instead, I wrote an email to the county clerk in that calm, boring tone that gets you what you want, asking a very procedural question about how names appear on marriage records and whether corrections can be made after printing, and the reply I received, which arrived at 3 in the morning as if bureaucracy has insomnia, explained in tidy paragraphs that the certificate lists only the legal parents of record unless an amendment is filed. A process that requires certain affidavits and a compelling reason, and tucked between the lines was my first real glimpse of the thing that would make or break the aisle decision, because sudden paperwork at the 11th hour is not romance, it is a fire drill, and someone had already pulled the alarm. By the time summer invitations were sealed, Emily had begun using a new phrase, "We're keeping it simple," which in wedding language means someone has decided that the person least likely to complain should absorb the damage, and I watched Mark decide, with that stubborn dignity that makes me both proud and furious, that he would not be the reason his daughter's day tasted like iron, even if it meant swallowing his tongue. But dignity is not a virtue that thrives without witnesses, and I am, for better or worse, very good at seeing, so I set a reminder to visit the county office the week before the ceremony with a folder I labeled plainly, "Father," and a plan that was not loud, not illegal, not even aggressive, merely accurate in a way that would make certain signatures pause before their ink hit paper, and as I zipped the folder I heard my phone buzz with a voicemail from a number I did not recognize. A soft voice introducing herself as the venue coordinator and asking whether I might confirm which gentleman would be listed on the escort card as father of the bride, because there seemed to be 2 versions in circulation, and, as she put it with all the fragile cheer of someone standing under falling glass, it would be a shame if the printer got the wrong one. The fracture was not one sudden earthquake that split the ground open in front of us. It was a slow erosion, small pieces crumbling until you no longer recognized the cliff edge you had been standing on. I can still recall the first time Emily looked her father in the eye with that careful smile people use when they are saying something cruel but want to soften the blow. The sort of smile that comes with explanations about why someone else's opinion matters more than yours. It was during her senior year of high school when the first serious boyfriend showed up, a boy named Tyler who played baseball and who had mastered the art of speaking directly to Greg as though he were the final authority on all things. Mark tried to join the conversation, tried to offer advice about scholarships and the dangers of being recruited without a contract, but Emily laughed politely and said Greg already had it handled. The words seemed harmless at the time, a throwaway line, but I watched them lodge deep in Mark's chest as though she had pulled his chair out from under him and asked him to thank her for it. It became a pattern that grew sharper in college. Every major decision came with an echo, tuition covered, car payments handled, but the credit for the steady hand never fell in his direction. When she needed rent for her first apartment, it was Mark's transfer that saved the day, but the public gratitude went to the stepfather who happened to hold the keys when she moved in. He joked once, half drunk and fully bitter, that he had become the family ATM with a father's face attached, and while everyone at the table chuckled uneasily and moved the conversation along, I saw the truth in it. Even Emily smiled in that way you do when you know the joke is too close to reality. The line hardened one Thanksgiving when we were all at the table, and Greg raised his glass to family, calling Emily his daughter with such smoothness it slid past most ears without resistance. Mark lifted his own glass, but his voice caught when he tried to add something, and in the silence that followed, Emily laughed nervously and said, "Come on, Dad, don't make it awkward." It was the word she used, Dad, but the direction her eyes took when she said it. She wasn't looking at her father. She was looking at the man who had come into her life after most of the heavy lifting had already been done. That moment, that single flicker of misalignment, was when I knew the crack had reached the foundation. By the time wedding planning began, Mark still paid for everything without protest, though his presence was negotiated in whispers and spreadsheets rather than spoken gratitude. When the conversation turned to the walk down the aisle, it was presented not as a choice, but as a foregone conclusion. Greg would be the one at her arm. Mark, they said gently, could sit in the front row and take comfort in knowing he had made it possible financially. The explanation sounded so tidy, almost reasonable, the way a surgeon might describe the removal of something unnecessary. But underneath, it was cruelty disguised as compromise. He didn't yell. He didn't throw accusations. He carried himself with the same deliberate calm he always had, though his hands shook when he thought no one was watching. He made the down payment for the venue. He transferred the final balance for the caterer. He even covered the photographer's deposit, the irony being that the man excluded from the aisle would be the one to ensure the pictures were even possible. Yet no speech, no card, no conversation held his name in it. His absence was planned in advance, polished into the schedule like a minor detail. What they did not expect, however, was that silence has weight, and Mark's refusal to argue gave it more gravity than any fight could. At the rehearsal dinner, when introductions were made, people leaned toward him, expecting him to say something, to demand his place. He offered nothing, only a nod and a measured smile that revealed nothing. That was his revenge, not a tantrum, not a desperate plea, but a vacuum so cold that it forced others to fill the air with their own guilt. I understood it then, watching from my seat at the edge of the room, how dignity can look like surrender, but is in fact a blade turned sideways. Every time Greg puffed his chest with a new line about fatherhood, the quiet man at the edge of the circle made his words ring thinner, hollower. Every time Emily brushed off his contribution with casual entitlement, she planted a seed she would later taste in bitterness. And though she could not yet see it, though she believed she had chosen the right version of a father, the ledger was already recording her decision, writing it in a script she would one day be forced to read aloud. The night before the wedding, I sat with Mark in the hotel lobby. He stirred his coffee with the slow rhythm of someone trying to keep their hands busy, and he said only one sentence to me: "I will not compete for what is already mine." I wanted to argue, to tell him that sometimes you have to fight for recognition, but the way he said it, calm, almost serene, shut me down. He wasn't surrendering, he was waiting. And in that moment I realized the silence he carried into that wedding was not weakness, but preparation, a sharpening of the blade he would never need to raise with his hands, because it would cut all the same. By the time dawn came and the doors opened on the ceremony, everyone in the room thought the matter was settled. Greg would walk the bride down the aisle, and Mark would sit quietly and applaud at the right times. But none of them understood that silence, when chosen, is not absence. It is presence in another form, heavier and harder to escape, and I knew, though they didn't, that the real reckoning would not be found in the walk or the speeches, but in what would come after. When applause had faded and reality demanded to be faced without the shield of music and flowers. The wedding day carried with it the kind of artificial serenity that only comes when too much money and too many fragile egos are involved. A polished veneer stretched tight over a room already humming with unspoken tension. And from the moment the first guests filed into the hall, it was clear that everything had been arranged with one goal in mind. Appearances must remain perfect, even if the truth had to be strangled in the corner to achieve it. The aisle gleamed under carefully timed lighting. The flowers were extravagant enough to smell like a greenhouse compressed into perfume, and the quartet rehearsed their crescendos as though music could disguise betrayal. Yet while Greg rehearsed the stride of a man stepping into history, and Linda adjusted her daughter's veil with a pride that carried the bitterness of triumph, Mark stood apart, silent and still, not fidgeting with his tie, not clearing his throat, simply waiting. As if he had already rehearsed the role he had been forced into, the quiet figure at the back who funds the spectacle yet is not permitted to take part in its story. There is a peculiar cruelty in how quickly a family can learn to pretend. Guests whispered in the pews about how beautiful the bride looked, how happy the couple seemed, and how seamlessly everything was organized, while I listened to the undercurrent. The too loud compliments meant to reinforce a narrative. The careful avoidance of eye contact with the man in the last row. Mark clapped when he was supposed to, nodded when someone brushed past him, and offered the kind of measured smile people wear when they are photographed against their will, and though he did not speak a single unnecessary word, his silence pressed against the edges of the hall with a density no speech could match. Greg walked Emily down the aisle, chin lifted in a parody of authority, but the moment was thinner than it appeared, and though cameras flashed to capture it, I saw the flicker in Emily's eyes when she glanced toward the back of the room where her father sat. Hands folded, his presence an accusation no lens could erase. The reception unfolded with the kind of mechanical joy that comes from contracts rather than impulse. Speeches were polished, jokes rehearsed, and even the laughter seemed rented for the occasion. I watched as Greg stood and declared himself blessed to have raised this remarkable young woman, and I listened as applause followed the words, a reflexive gesture by people too polite to notice that the story had been rewritten mid-sentence. Mark raised his glass as well, not out of agreement, but because he understood the art of surviving humiliation without flinching. He did not correct the record, did not remind the room who had signed the tuition checks or who had worked overtime shifts to cover orthodontist bills. Instead, he sipped slowly, and in that quiet gesture there was something harder than denial. There was refusal, not to accept what was being said, but to lend it his outrage, because outrage is a gift, and he had decided no one here deserved it. I began to realize that his revenge, if that is even the right word, was not some grand act of exposure or confrontation, but the decision to let the lie exist unchallenged, knowing that its fragility would eventually collapse under its own weight. People expected drama, expected the excluded father to rise and demand acknowledgement, to ruin the carefully staged harmony, but his choice to remain silent transformed the entire event into something grotesque. Because every person who looked at him understood, even if they never admitted it aloud, that dignity had been denied a role and was sitting quietly in the back. And that understanding turned the celebration sour in ways that lingered far longer than a shouted protest ever could. When the slideshow began, the one I had quietly tampered with, the air shifted once more. Images of Emily and Mark appeared alongside the curated collection of family photos, and though no explanation was given, no words spoken, the story corrected itself in real time. Guests murmured softly, glancing between the screen and the man at the back, and even Linda's practiced composure cracked for a second as her eyes darted toward him. Emily's lips trembled when she saw the picture of herself as a child wobbling on her bicycle, her father's steady hand hovering close, but not quite touching, and for a moment I thought she might break down entirely. She did not, but the truth had already taken its seat among the guests, and it did not need an invitation. By the end of the evening, applause and music could not erase the taste of unease. People filed out making polite comments about how beautiful the wedding had been, but their voices lacked conviction, as though they sensed the hollow space at the center of it all. Mark stood only when it was time to leave, offered his hand to a relative who barely knew what to say, and disappeared into the night with the same calm he had carried all day. I knew then that this silence was not weakness, not surrender, but a calculated endurance that left the story incomplete, because nothing unsettles the human heart more than an ending without resolution. Everyone there wanted him to shout, to demand recognition, to create a scene they could dismiss as bitterness, but he denied them even that comfort. As the last lights dimmed and the hall emptied, I caught sight of Emily standing near the door, veil lifted, eyes rimmed with the kind of redness that makeup cannot conceal. She looked toward the street where her father's car had vanished and pressed her hands together in a nervous gesture I had not seen since she was a child. I knew then that silence had cut deeper than any words could have, and that the real story of this wedding was not the polished perfection of the ceremony, but the absence that hung heavy over it. An absence that could not be cropped from photos or edited out of memory. What remained, louder than speeches or vows, was the unanswered question of whether the man who had been called just the money would ever let his daughter back into the space his silence had created, or whether she would spend the rest of her life trying to reach a voice that refused to answer. Morning came in that thin gray that makes even expensive flowers look a little embarrassed, and while steam rose from the cup I kept forgetting to drink, Mark's phone began to stutter across the table with the frantic rhythm of a wound waking up. Each vibration a small apology for a night that had finally exhausted its choreography, and when I glanced at the screen I saw the lengthening stack of voice notes, one after another until the count became a shape rather than a number, and I understood. Without pressing play, that somewhere in a hotel room still smelling of hairspray and champagne, Emily had discovered that applause cannot muffle the sound of a decision echoing back at you. She sent the first message small and careful, the voice of a girl asking the dark to be less dark, and then she sent the rest as if she were throwing pebbles at a window that would not open. Words tumbling over themselves about the slideshow and the sideways looks and the way Greg's triumph had curdled after. Relatives began whispering, and about how Linda's smile had held too long until it cracked, and finally about the photo of the bicycle, the hand hovering, the love that did not need to be seen to be real. She asked him to talk, to please talk, to say anything. And I listened to none of them yet heard all of it, because grief has only a few melodies and families recycle them like lullabies turned funeral marches. There is a moment, always, when a story tries to rewrite itself in the morning, when the cast stumbles out of costume and searches for whichever version of themselves can survive the daylight. And I watched Mark sit with that moment as if it were a guest he had decided to treat politely, his thumbs tucked under the edge of the phone, his eyes anywhere but the blue-lit screen, and I remembered the sentence he had said to me in the lobby, that he would not compete for what was already his, which sounded like stubbornness to me then, and now sounded like a boundary with teeth. He asked me to read the county clerk's email again, the one I had kept like a talisman, and I did. Reciting the bureaucratic gospel that the certificate lists legal parents and no stepfather's pride could amend that without a set of affidavits and a reason compelling enough to survive a boring clerk's scrutiny. And we sat in the strange comfort of paperwork, because sometimes the fairest revenge is the quiet insistence on what is already true. I am not a saint and have never pretended to be, so I will admit that I had scheduled something for this morning that would either heal or sting depending on who opened it first. A shared album link with a plain title, for Emily's children, sent to family and a few friends who would inevitably become archivists, not a takedown or a speech disguised as nostalgia, just photographs arranged so the arc could not be misread, the hospital chair and the juice box, the tilted futon and the thrift store gown, the parking lot chalk and the steady hand hovering near scraped knees, and I included a short note with no adjectives, only dates and places, because a lie chokes hardest on detail, and I wanted the future to find receipts, not opinions. I also placed a printed statement in a simple envelope, the kind of stationery a bank uses when it wants to look trustworthy, setting up a modest trust in Emily's name with terms that would read petty to the uninitiated and principled to the tired. No withdrawals for spectacle, no access for anyone but the legal daughter and, someday, if she chose, her children, the balance funded by a chunk of money that had been meant to buy Greg his victory lap during the honeymoon. And if that sounds like a knife, then believe me when I say it is the gentlest knife I own, because it cuts only through pretense and shields the soft parts for later. The voice notes kept arriving, her breath catching on the edges of words like humiliated and wrong and please, and I could feel the audience inside me, the part of me that is a sister, a daughter. A woman who knows how easy it is to confuse a performance for a plan, pulling towards sympathy even as another part, the one that keeps score not to punish, but to keep us honest, held its line, and yes, I knew I was orchestrating. That I was arranging the chessboard so revelation would have better lighting, but I also knew that if I fed this moment with outrage it would burn hot and brief, then die, while if I fed it with silence it would smolder long enough for understanding to catch. When at last Mark tapped the first message and her voice filled the room, older than yesterday, younger than tomorrow, cracked open in the middle, he closed his eyes and let it wash him without moving, and I watched a man make the hardest choice a parent can make, to decide that the lesson must be learned in the quiet or else it is not learned at all, and that love which capitulates to spectacle is not love, but stagecraft with a catering budget. I will confess to one last move that felt like a petty miracle and a practical kindness at the same time. I forwarded the venue's final invoice, which had arrived at dawn as though shame runs accounting, to Greg with a single sentence that would look polite if framed and hung, "Please settle this balance directly," and I copied Linda, not to humiliate, but to end a habit, because women like me get exhausted carrying the weight of other people's narratives. And sometimes the wickedest mercy is the one that forces a person to hold their own checkbook, and as I pressed send I felt that small electric peace that comes when you stop being a hostage to someone else's edit. Mark did not notice. He was busy listening to the 17th message, the one where Emily dropped her voice and said she had seen the certificate and the album and understood that truth had been sitting in the back row and she had walked past it, and that she did not know how to turn around without breaking something. He set the phone down face up so the screen would dim on its own, folded his hands like a man who has decided not to play a game anymore, and he asked me, not rhetorically, whether answering would teach her that you can insult love in public and repair it in private before breakfast, and though my mouth formed a dozen speeches I did not deliver any of them, because sermons are for people who want applause and he wanted spine. Instead I slid the trust envelope across the table and told him that sometimes you speak by where you place the future, and that a door can be neither open nor closed so much as waiting for the right knock. Outside, the world had the decency to start making noise, trucks, birds, the low, bored sigh of a city forgiving itself another day, and in that ordinary sound the wedding shrank to its proper size, a costly party that had failed to carry its own weight. And the only thing left that mattered was whether a father would find words or keep sharpening silence. The phone lit again as if on cue, the draft reply blinking under his thumb like a heartbeat he could borrow, and I watched him breathe the slow breath of someone who wants to fix everything and also wants to stop fixing what others keep breaking. And I did not move his hand or my own, because the choice was not mine, and because suspense, when it belongs to reality rather than a script, is the only honest ending we ever get.